Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar on the long-awaited SEN review. Before we start today's presentation, a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A function and I will answer the questions, but at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. My name is Thomas Emmett and I am the Head of Education at Burkitt Long. For those of you who don't know Burkitt Long, we're a law firm that has advised clients on education law for decades. We support parents, guardians and young people in SEN law matters, hence our keen interest in the contents of the SEN review and our desire to present this webinar to you today. Next slide, please. Moving on to our agenda for today's webinar, I will first introduce the SEN review before moving on to look at the contents of each chapter. Next slide, please. I will then give our views on the proposals contained in the SEN review, provide you with information as to where you can find the consultation questions, and advise on how you can have your voice heard. I will then point you to our social media platforms, which have a wealth of information, and our future events, after which I will take questions. Next slide, please. Just quickly before we move on to the substantive content of today's webinar, a note that this presentation is for general purposes only and the information is correct as at today, the 28th of April. Next slide, please. So I think it's best to start with the simple question of what is the SEN review? Well, on the 29th of March 2022, the government published a green paper with proposals for changing and improving the SEN and alternative provision system in England. Those proposals are out for consultation and they will be tweaked, fleshed out and changed over time. Why has the government put forward changes to the SEN and alternative provision system? Well, the Children and Families Act 2014 introduced reform to previous legislation by having an ambitious aim of ensuring collaboration between education, health and care via an integrated 0 to 25 system. The goal was to give support to children and young people with SEN and their families in order to prepare them for adulthood. In a lot of ways, this ambition has not been met, with the government itself acknowledging that too often children and young people with SEN and those educated in alternative provision feel unsupported, and their outcomes fall behind those of their peers. Too many parents are navigating an adversarial system and face difficulty and delay in accessing support for their child. This is why changes are needed to the systems. Next slide, please. There are significant challenges facing the SEN and alternative provision system, which I'm sure those watching this webinar appreciate. The government points to a few of them in the Green Paper, including the fact that outcomes for children and young people with SEN or those in alternative provision are poor. The SEN review explains that children and young people with SEN have consistently worse outcomes than their peers across every measure. This includes poor educational attendance, and a statistic from 2019, there was just 22% of individuals with SEN that reached the expected standard in reading, writing and maths. It will come as no surprise that the pandemic has exacerbated challenges, with 68% of parents in 2021 reporting that their child's needs were not met at all or only somewhat met in accordance with their EHCP. Unsurprisingly for anyone involved with the SEN and alternative provision system, it has been pointed out that those that are exposed to the systems, whether children, young people and or their families, do not find it a positive experience. The SEN review highlights how the system is bureaucratic and adversarial rather than the collaborative and inquisitorial experience of which that was the intention of the Children and Families Act 2014. Examples of bureaucracy given by the government include families having to engage with multiple services and assessments, and that the system is not equally accessible to everyone. Parents and carers that have access to financial and social resources are often better placed to navigate the system and ultimately secure support for their child. It is not a fantasy that some parents are unable to access the system due to being bamboozled by various acronyms, not having their rights explained to them, and a lack of clarity around what services can be expected to assist them. This results in them going around in circles trying to obtain the relevant information. It is therefore understandable that parents and carers have resorted to show their frustration with the system by appealing to the SEND Tribunal. Since 2015, the appeal rate to the Tribunal has increased year on year, with there being no indication that this will decrease. In the year 2020-2021, there was 8,600 registered SEN appeals. This was an increase in 8% from the year before. It is also important to note that 96% of the cases considered by the Tribunal were at least partly in favour of the parent or the carer. A further rather shocking statistic stated in the SEN review is that out of 141 local area inspections published by the 21st of March 2022, 76 had resulted in a written statement of action indicating significant weaknesses in SEN arrangements. Next slide, please. The government explains in the SEN review that 8 billion in 2021-2022 was spent as part of the high needs budget, sometimes known as the dedicated SEN budget, with the budget for 2022-2023 having an allocation of 9.1 billion. It is explained that the budget has risen by more than 40% over the last 3 years, yet spending is outstripping funding. Of particular concern is that 2/3 of local authorities have deficits in their dedicated schools grant budgets, that is the main school funding, which includes SEN but is not solely dedicated to it, as a result of those high needs cost pressures. Once again, forecasts do not show this to be slowing down anytime soon. The SEN review also highlights how local governments are resorting to being creative and using alternative provision to supplement the SEN system by using them to provide SEN support and temporary placements. This is due to insufficient capacity in special schools. The government is also of the view that there is a vicious cycle of late intervention, low confidence and inefficient resource allocation driving the challenges faced. The government has specifically honed in on the fact that there is a lack of confidence from parents and carers in local mainstream schools to meet the needs of children with SEN. It is noted that more children and young people are receiving EHCPs and are attending specialist settings, meaning more financial resource and workforce capacity is pulled from the mainstream end of the continuum to the specialist end. Subsequently, this results in mainstream settings being less able to deliver the early intervention required in an effective and timely manner, hence creating what the government has labelled a vicious cycle. Throughout the SEN review, it is obvious how parents and carers are frustrated with the difficulties and delays they face in securing the support required for their child. There is a reference to parents not feeling confident in seeking out support, particularly in respect of social care, due to a fear that they will be blamed for the challenges their children face. This then leads to further delays which may have been avoided if there had been trust in the system. But it's not just parents and carers who have a mistrust in the system, with providers and local authorities also lacking confidence. The government believes that the current system is not determined by a child or young person's needs, but in fact where they happen to live. The concern raised throughout the SEN review is that there is significant inconsistency in how children and young people's needs are met throughout the country. Next slide, please. Turning to Chapter 2 of the review, the first proposal to consider is the single national SEN and alternative provision system. The government is proposing that a new national SEN alternative provision system is established, with nationally consistent standards being set as to how needs are identified and met at every stage of a child's journey across education, health and care. The intention is that decisions about support and provision are made based on a child or young person's needs, not where they live or the setting that they attend. If this proposal does not sound groundbreaking, that's because it's not a new concept. As previously mentioned, the current system under the Children and Families Act intended for a single national SEN system to be in place. It is currently unclear what the nationally consistent standards are, as the SEN review does not give any detail, and in fact seeks views by way of consultation question 1. It does promise, however, that they will be specific as to what should be made available universally in mainstream settings, as well as create guidance on when an EHCP is required and when specialist provision, including alternative provision, is most appropriate for meeting a child or young person's needs. The government explains that the SEND Code of Practice will also be updated to reflect these nationally consistent standards and processes. In terms of local SEND partnerships, this may sound familiar as well, as current legislation provides a requirement for local offers to be available, explaining what is offered in each area. It is not clear as to the structure of the local SEND partnerships, except that the intentions are to bring together education, health and care partners with local government. A further proposal is to have multi-agency panels in place to provide impartiality to the education and healthcare needs assessment process. It is noted that some local authorities are already implementing this, but the SEND review does not expand on how successful those panels have been in their decision making and whether there is a notable reduction in appeals for those local authorities compared to those that do not have such panels. The SEND review has found that each local area has their own version of what an EHCP should look like, which has led to a lack of consistency and therefore varying levels of information being specified within the document. The proposal is to introduce a standardised EHCP template, which focuses on the support being put in place for a child or a young person, including whether it should be classed as education, health, and care intervention, so it is funded by the appropriate service. This proposal does not address concerns relating to bureaucracy. EHCPs are, at the moment, being prepared based on very outdated information a lot of the time, which has arisen due to a lack of collaboration and engagement between the different sectors and are often dependent on the draftsman's intentions. It is interesting to note there has also been an emphasis by the government on introducing a requirement to discuss and record at annual reviews as to whether a step down to targeted support and cessation of an EHCP is required. The SEND review does not go into specifics as to what the EHCP template will look like, and consultation question 4 seeks views on what components of the EHCP should be amended or reviewed. Next slide, please. There is a proposal to digitalise EHCPs and for there to be a central location where the new digital EHCP template is held. This location would also create a place for parents, carers and professionals to upload key information and produce, maintain and review an EHCP in a streamlined way. This is a completely new concept as there is no system currently like this in place. This is positive in theory, as it will allow an audit trail of decisions and encompasses the collaborative approach of shared information. However, it does need to be confirmed that everyone will be able to access this system. The government will also need to ensure that there are appropriate controls in place and will need to comply with the UK GDPR. How this will be ensured and the finer details of the system are yet to be set out and are not included in the SEND review. In respect to the process for naming a place within an EHCP, whilst a list may be helpful for parents and carers who have limited knowledge of schools in their area or types of placement available for their child or young person, although this should ideally be rectified by the local inclusion plan, this is not usually where the issues tend to arise. Rather, problems relate to capacity of educational placements and funding. The government has not explained how this list will be tailored, and most notably does not explain how this will not significantly reduce parental preference. For me, the inclusion of mandatory mediation is a cause of concern. At the moment, should parties decide to proceed with mediation, local authorities tend to fail to send a decision maker, which then fails to move the matter forward. Another issue is that disputes often require judicial scrutiny, with parties having entrenched opposing views, and there is no flexibility. The details relating to how parties should engage in mediation, including timescales and who is deemed a local authority decision maker, has not been included in the SEND review. It appears that the government itself may be having doubts as to the success of this mandatory mediation proposal, as it follows up in the SEND review by explaining they will continue to scrutinise the proposal and consider whether it is necessary to introduce an additional measure in the form of an independent review mechanism. This mechanism in itself causes a number of concerns. mainly in respect to the powers it may have to bind the parties to any decision that it may make. Again, there is no detail on this independent review mechanism within the SEN review. The greatest concern is that these proposals may be an attempt at deterring parents and carers from utilising the rights provided to them under legislation, and will not be beneficial to the parties, with these steps creating further delays before a resolution is granted. And delays means time and financial burden for both parties. Next slide, please. Turn to chapter 3. The government agrees that it is important to identify need at the earliest opportunity in high quality early year provision. They have suggested exploring ways to upskill early year practitioners in undertaking the EYFS 2-year-old progress check, and encourage further integration to join up across education and health services. They've stated they'd like to increase specialist SEN expertise by increasing the number of trained and qualified SENCOs in early year settings, with a view for training to be delivered up to 5,000 SENCOs. They've also committed themselves in the paper to the review of the Level 3 Early Years Educator qualification and the increase of the number of SEN qualified Level 3 practitioners in early year settings. The government has said it will also try to support families at every stage of a child's journey by improving the availability of early support for families, investing in family hubs in 75 local authorities, expanding the reach of the Supporting Families programme, establishing more than 10,000 additional respite places, and reviewing the recommendations of the independent review of children's social care when that is published. There is also a view to deliver excellent teaching and high standards of curriculum in every mainstream school. The government has published a white paper that emphasises the levelling up agenda that it has, with a very aspirational target of 90% of primary school children having achieved the expected standard in reading, writing and mathematics by 2030. This cannot be achieved without additional support being provided for children and young people with additional needs, both in mainstream and alternative provision. There is also a view to deliver excellent teaching and high standards of curriculum in every mainstream school. The government has proposed investment that will be made in new research on SEN classroom-based practice, exploring options to build this evidence base with a range of partners, including the Education Endowment Foundation. It says that it will continue to deliver a transformed professional development pathway for teachers with high quality training at every step of their career. They will establish an institute of training, which will become England's flagship teacher development provider. It will provide clear guidance on the effective use and deployment of teaching assistants to support children and young people with SEN as part of the national standards, and introduce a new leadership SENCO MPQ to replace the current award. The government also recommends that SENCOs are given sufficient protected time to carry out their role and are provided with dedicated administrative support to reduce the time they spend on administrative work. Next slide, please. So what's the government said about improving timely access to specialist support? Well, steps are being taken to increase the capacity of the specialist workforce, the government say. The Department of Health and Social Care will work with Health Education England, NHS England, and the Department for Education to build on existing evidence and build a clearer picture of demand for support for children and young people with SEN from the therapy and diagnostic workforce. They wish to work to ensure that the joint needs assessment and local inclusion plans support better joined up workforce planning across education, health and care to enable schools and colleges to access a specialist workforce on a targeted basis. They also intend to test the value of embedding multidisciplinary teams of specialists in alternative provision. There is also an investment pledge by the government in the SEN review. The government has said that it will invest £2.6 billion over the next 3 years to deliver new places and improve existing provision for children and young people with SEN or who require alternative provision. As part of the new special and alternative provision Free Schools Wave, priority will be given to local authorities in need of further specialist provision. Priority will be given to those LAs who need to reduce their dedicated schools grant deficits, and where a new free school will enable the local authority to provide more effective and efficient SEND provision. Arguably most notably, there is an ambition by the year 2030 that every specialist setting will become part of a multi-academy trust. The schools white paper mentioned earlier is very clear about the benefits for schools, parents, carers and pupils of having a well-regulated trust-led system. There are proposals that both types, that's specialist only and mixed trusts, are encouraged to coexist in the trust-led future, and that currently local authority maintain special schools and alternative provision are given the choice as to which type of trust they join based on their individual and local circumstances. There is also quite a focus on supporting young people in their transition to further education. The government wants the new national standards to include standards for transition, providing consistent, timely, and they hope high quality transition preparation for children and young people with SEN. There is a proposal to expand the use of the common transfer files to facilitate smooth transition planning. These files would share relevant data between schools and further education settings about a young person's needs and ensure that the right support is in place from day one. Next slide, please. And the government is looking to prepare young people with SEN for adulthood, which is something they are said to be focusing on at the moment, but with a further focus, they're looking to roll out improved careers guidance, including better information about the support that is available to them as they move into work. There is an intention to add additional supported internships over the next 3 years. There is intended investment in a comprehensive package of professional development, which includes upskilling providers and employers in making reasonable adjustments for apprentices with learning difficulties and or disabilities. Next slide, please. Turning to chapter 4, and arguably one of the most notable proposals the government has made, and that is for a reformed role for the alternative provision system. Currently, there is no coherent agreed purpose for alternative provision. The SEN review has highlighted a need for making alternative provision an integral part of local SEN systems and ensure that they have financial stability to focus on early intervention. An aim is for these alternative provisions to be included in the push for strong multi-academy trusts. The alternative provision will be governed by a bespoke performance framework, which will set robust standards to ensure progress, reintegration into mainstream education, or sustainable post-16 destinations for children and young people. The government has explained that there is a need for greater oversight and transparency of pupil movements. There is also a request for evidence before the summer on the use of unregistered provision to investigate existing practices. This is because the government is concerned that commissioners are using a combination of part-time placements to create a full-time education package for children and young people, which is not joined up, and no single local body being responsible for ensuring that children or young people are attending full-time education across a week. The government has proposed to hold local authorities and multi-academy trusts to account for local delivery. They intend to create a system where incentives prioritise the needs of every child and young person, and where effective integrated local delivery is achieved through collaboration, joint working and strategic leadership. It remains to be seen whether this can be achieved. The government also intends to build capacity to create what it describes as world-class support in every area. This includes working with the sector to develop and disseminate an understanding of effective alternative provision practice, and they are said to be working to ensure that the system is set up for success. That includes the development of a bespoke national alternative provision performance framework to ensure commissioners can identify good provision, which will which will include a new performance table for alternative provision schools. The performance framework will be based on 5 outcomes, and that's effective outreach support, improved attendance, reintegration, academic attainment with a focus on English and maths, and successful post-16 transition. Next slide, please. The government also proposes to improve oversight of alternative provision placements. They intend to carry out a review on how children and young people move around the school system, including through off-site direction and unregulated managed moves, with a view to introducing a statutory framework for all pupil movements. Next slide, please. The government has explained that a clarity in roles and responsibilities is extremely important, with every partner across education, healthcare and local government having a clear role to play and being equipped with the levers to fulfil their responsibility, and they need to be equipped with the levers to fulfil their responsibilities, and of course that is quite right. It is explained in the SEN review that the government will create a system where incentives prioritise the needs of every child and young person and every partner with a clear role, and they need to be equipped to meet that role. The proposals feel vague and amount to political jargon in my view, as it does not explain what the incentives and levers are to be put in place and how they're going to be implemented practically. There are proposals to establish a new regions group by summer 2022, bringing together functions currently distributed across the Department for Education and the ESFA into a single interface. The Department for Education will support local authorities in the development and review of local inclusion plans to ensure that they are built on strong evidence, they are forward-looking, and they have considered emerging trends and are co-produced with parents to inform effective local delivery. In terms of strengthening accountability within the health system, the guidance will be designed to there will be guidance to set out clearly how the statutory responsibilities for SEN should be discharged with the ICB, including that there must be an identified executive lead for SEN who sits on the board. Next slide, please. The government wishes to make use of data in the SEN system and be better at it. They propose to introduce new local and national inclusion dashboards, setting out clear performance data and metrics across education, health and care for strengthened accountability and transparency to parents. It is said the DfE will work with all those involved in the SEN system to identify the most informative and appropriate data across themes against the national SEN standards at a national and local authority level. And where data isn't currently available, the government has said it will work with partners to develop it. The idea is it will help track outcomes and experiences, identify need, and also value for money. In terms of a new inclusion dashboard for 0 to 25 provision, there is a proposal to introduce this dashboard, setting out clear performance data and metrics across education, health and care for strengthened accountability and transparency to parents, which of course can only be a good thing. It is not clear what performances are to be measured other than outcomes and experiences, identification of need and value for money, and the SEN review explains that they will work with all those involved with the SEN system to identify the most informative and appropriate data across themes against the national standards. The government has said that it will work with Ofsted to update the local area SEN alternative provision inspection framework. And also that it will, in terms of the new national framework, it will look at banding and price tariffs for funding. The idea of banding and price tariffs is not a new concept, with many local authorities already using their own banding system to distribute its funding from its high needs block. The issue, however, is that local arrangements mean inconsistency, which results in the postcode lottery dilemma. There has been acceptance by the government that aligning the current system with a national standard will be a challenge, and the government has explained that there will be work with local authorities and a pilot on a smaller scale before wider implementation to assist with that. The question remains, however, as to what these bands will financially amount to, and therefore what would be expected from each banding. Next slide, please. In Chapter 6, the government has put forward proposals to establish a national SEND delivery board. This will include a dedicated SEN and alternative provision director within the DfE, who's responsible for overseeing the development of a new national SEN standard. And there is a proposal to establish the board that will bring together the relevant government departments with national delivery partners, and that includes parents and representatives of local government, education, health and care, to hold partners to account for the timely development and improvement of the system. Next slide, please. So, our views on the proposals. Whilst there are many proposals which are familiar to those experienced with the current SEND system, such as the need for joined up working, this SEN review has also proposed some interesting suggestions which have the potential to bring positive reform. For example, a standardised EHCP template, more information sharing, and looking at early intervention. But there are issues with seemingly an attempt in reducing litigation by adding additional hurdles and barriers for parents and carers to overcome before being able to redress their potential or their actual dispute with a local authority. One thing is clear throughout the SEN review, which is no surprise to anyone involved in the SEN sector right now, which is that there does need to be change, but it needs to happen now, as opposed to some of the timeframes that are being provided by the government. Next slide, please. The consultation questions can be found on pages 80, 81 and 82 of the SEN review. For a breakdown of each of the questions, we would recommend that you visit the Special Needs Jungle website, as they provide an excellent breakdown on each question. Next slide, please. In terms of how you can get involved directly with the consultation, it's stated at the moment that it will end on the 1st of July 2022, but there are murmurs across social media that this may be extended due to a delay in an accessible version of the SEN review. But working on the basis of that deadline, if anyone is interested in having their say or commenting on the proposals, they should do so by 11:45 p.m. On the date that you can see on the screen. And there are some links as well, and an email address if you prefer to send your comments via email. Next slide, please. We always welcome feedback on our webinars, so I would be most grateful if you could take a little bit of time out of your day and to share your thoughts with us on this webinar. And there is a link there on the slide. Next slide, please. In terms of upcoming events, we're very excited to announce a SEN Law Q&A session, which will be on the 10th of May between 6 and 7 o'clock. This is an open forum for parents, guardians and young people, where they can ask questions of our SEN solicitors. Please feel free to join us if this is something that would be of interest to you. Further details will be published across our social media platforms in the fullness of time, but there you can sign up on the events page, the firm's events page. And as I said, further details will be provided on Twitter, LinkedIn and all other major social platforms. And speaking of which, on the next slide, this is where you can find us. So a lot of information is shared by myself actually on behalf of the firm through the Twitter page that is specific for SEN, or the Twitter account specifically for SEN, and that's at BL SEN Law. In terms of Facebook, we have set up an advice group for parents, guardians and young people where they can ask questions, and our SEN experts are monitoring that Facebook group and provide input regularly. So it is well worth, if you have a specific question about your specific circumstances, please feel free to put your question into the group, or alternatively contact us directly, and we'd be more than happy to have an initial consultation with you. And also we have a LinkedIn page as well that's specifically for special educational needs and disability. Next slide, please. And so we have moved on to the questions part of the webinar. Are there any questions, Katie or Jenny?
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, we've had one so far, so if anyone does have any more, please do put them in the Q&A. So Eleanor asks, how realistic is it to leave accountability to the DfE, particularly given the ineffectiveness to date of the Ofsted LA inspection process to achieve this?
I'm hesitant to give too much of an opinion on a government department, but I think if you wanted my view on that, it would be the same as the implication of the question. So I think there is, you're hinting towards the idea that it may not have been effectively achieved to date, and I may share that view. Am I hopeful that the SEN review is going to bring about change in that regard? Unfortunately, my answer is probably no. However, we have to hold out hope that what is set out in the paper is actually followed through. Are there any other questions at all?
No, no more have come through.
Okay, brilliant. Next slide, please. So please feel free to contact me directly if you have any further questions that you didn't want to answer as part of the webinar. My details are on the screen, and all that is left for me to say is thank you very much for spending your time with me this morning, and thank you for joining us.